Waiter refuses to serve elderly black woman, stunned when her son reveals who she is. When an elderly woman walked into a luxurious restaurant, no one suspected that her quiet presence would expose a shocking truth and bring the entire room to a standstill. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the wide glass windows of the Sterling Room, a renowned fine dining establishment in Havencrest, a city known for its exclusivity and high society. Inside, the air was filled with the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the delicate notes of a pianist playing in the corner. It was a kind of place where patrons came to celebrate milestones or finalize lucrative business deals, where tailored suits and polished decor spoke of quiet luxury. Then, the entrance door swung open at a hush, almost imperceptible, rippled through the room as an elderly black woman stepped inside. Her movements were slow but deliberate, her back straight despite the weight of her years. She was dressed in a navy blue coat adorned with delicate embroidery at the cuffs, a small black handbag tucked neatly under her arm. There was something about her, a quiet authority, a presence that turned a few heads, though many quickly dismissed her. At the hostess stand, a young woman in a sleek uniform greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, glancing briefly over her shoulder, as if ensuring she wasn't holding up the line. "Yes," the woman replied, her voice smooth and steady. "Under the name Mrs. Ellington." The hostess scanned the list, nodded, and gestured for her to follow. Instead of leading her to one of the more desirable tables by the grand windows, she guided her toward a tucked-away corner near the kitchen, a seat noticeably less prestigious. But Mrs. Ellington didn't complain. She took her seat with grace, folded her hands on the table, and calmly glanced at the menu. Something was off. Minutes passed. Then several more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Ethan, walked past her table multiple times, barely sparing her a glance. She observed as he moved effortlessly between tables, engaging customers with charming smiles and easy conversation. When he finally stopped at her table, his smile was thin, forced. "Sorry for the wait," he said briskly. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Ellington nodded gracefully. "Take your time," she said. But she had already noticed something. Nearby tables, filled with younger, more casually dressed patrons, were receiving immediate and attentive service. A woman 2 tables over whispered something to her dining partner, both sneaking glances in Mrs. Ellington's direction. Another diner furrowed their brow as if trying to place why she seemed so out of place in this setting. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Ethan finally returned, but his tone remained cold. "We're a little understaffed today," he said flatly. "Might be a while before I can get to you." Mrs. Ellington's lips pressed into a faint, knowing smile. "No rush," she replied, her tone betraying none of the frustration she might have felt. She wasn't about to make a scene. But the tension in the air, it was unmistakable. From across the room, someone else noticed everything, and their expression darkened. Mrs. Ellington remained poised, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the table, as if she were merely passing time. This wasn't her first encounter with this kind of subtle mistreatment, the kind that wasn't loud or obvious, but insidious in every delayed response, every dismissive glance. Meanwhile, Ethan continued serving other tables with effortless charm, laughing, engaging, moving past her again without so much as a glance. But now, the other diners were beginning to notice that at the center of the room, a young couple exchanged uneasy looks. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman whispered. Her partner shrugged, stealing a glance at Ethan, who seemed completely indifferent. Seconds turned into minutes. Still no service. Mrs. Ellington reached for her water glass, empty. A few tables away, a waiter delivered a fresh glass of wine to a customer who had arrived long after she had. Then Ethan reappeared, carrying a tray of food. But it wasn't for her. And in that moment, someone decided they had seen enough. Ethan barely slowed his pace as he passed Mrs. Ellington's table, his posture rigid with impatience. "Still deciding?" he asked, his voice lacking any real interest. His tone suggested that her delay, if you could even call it that, was an inconvenience rather than a simple part of the dining experience. Mrs. Ellington looked up at him, her expression composed but unwavering. There was something in her gaze, calm, expectant, yet quietly firm, that made Ethan hesitate for just a moment. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said smoothly, her voice even, refusing to rise to his dismissive tone. Ethan nodded sharply and muttered something under his breath before turning away, but he didn't notice the man watching him from across the room. Seated at a corner table near the bar, Julian Ellington rested one hand lightly on his glass, the other drumming his fingers against the smooth surface of the table. His face remained impassive, unreadable, but his sharp eyes tracked Ethan's every move. He had watched the entire interaction, and it wasn't the first time he had noticed something was off. The delay in service, the subtle dismissals, the way Ethan's posture and tone shifted depending on which guests he spoke to. Julian knew this restaurant inside and out. After all, the Sterling Room was his. But right now, he felt like a stranger in his own domain. Because the woman Ethan was so casually disregarding? She wasn't just another patron, she was his mother. And Julian was watching, waiting to see how far Ethan would take this. For now, he remained silent, his expression carefully controlled. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him patience was a powerful tool. Letting people reveal their true selves before stepping in often yielded the most effective results. But this wasn't just about business. This was personal. He took in every detail. The way Ethan's demeanor brightened when he greeted other guests, his effortless charm on full display. But the moment he turned toward Mrs. Ellington, the warmth faded. His tone flattened. Julian caught the small smirk Ethan exchanged with another server, a silent joke at his mother's expense. Julian's grip on his glass tightened. His mother had always been his greatest influence, the one who instilled in him the values of hard work, fairness, and dignity. She had encouraged him when the odds were stacked against him, when people doubted his ability to build something meaningful. The Sterling Room was not just a restaurant. It was a reflection of her principles. And yet, here she was, in his restaurant, being treated like she didn't belong to Mrs. Ellington, as always, remained composed. Julian knew she wouldn't complain. It wasn't in her nature. She believed in letting actions speak louder than words. Julian also believed in actions, and soon Ethan would learn that disrespect, especially toward his mother, had consequences, that a shift in the atmosphere was beginning to take hold. Other guests were noticing the imbalance, their conversations quieting as they glanced toward table 12. Even the pianist, normally lost in his melodies, hesitated slightly before continuing to play. Julian signaled to Dana, the restaurant's manager. The seasoned woman approached cautiously. She had worked with Julian long enough to recognize the warning signs, the slight tension in his jaw, the clipped way he exhaled. "Keep an eye on table 12, Julian said, his voice low, controlled. "I want to see how Ethan handles this. Don't interfere." Yet, Dana hesitated but nodded. She knew better than to question him when he spoke in that tone. Ethan, however, remained oblivious to Mrs. Ellington glanced at her watch, her movements graceful, unhurried. She would not demand service. She would not make a scene. But her patience, her silent endurance, spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. Ethan passed her table once more, his gaze deliberately avoiding hers. This time, Mrs. Ellington raised her hand, elegant calm. "Excuse me," she said softly, and yet the quiet authority in her voice cut through the air like a blade. Ethan paused, his expression tightening with impatience. "Yes?" he asked curtly, barely masking his irritation. Mrs. Ellington looked up at him, her eyes steady and kind, yet carrying a quiet intensity that made him falter. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy," she said, her tone as composed as ever. Ethan sighed audibly, glancing around as if looking for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. At that moment, Elijah Ellington rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. The room seemed to shift as he crossed it, his presence commanding. Without a word, he reached Ethan just as the waiter was laughing at a joke from another table. The casual arrogance on Ethan's face melted into confusion when he noticed Elijah standing beside him. Elijah. Hey, Ethan stammered, forcing a smile. I didn't know you were here. I've been here, Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. And I've been watching. Ethan's smile faltered. Watching what? Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table and then back to Ethan. Watching you ignore my mother, who's been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water. The color drained from Ethan's face. He glanced toward Mrs. Ellington, now sitting upright, her calm gaze locked onto the interaction. You're your mother? Ethan stammered. Yes, Elijah said, his tone sharpening. The woman you treated like an inconvenience. The woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect you've been showering on every other table in this room. The restaurant fell silent. Conversations halted. Even the pianist hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah cut him off. Save it, he said coldly. There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it. Elijah turned to Dana, the manager, who had been hovering near the bar, unsure whether to intervene. Dana, Elijah said, his voice steady. Take over table 12. Make sure my mother has everything she needs, immediately. Dana nodded quickly, rushing to Mrs. Ellington's table, with a flurry of apologies. She poured her a fresh glass of water and placed a menu in front of her with a nervous smile. Elijah turned back to Ethan, his expression unreadable. We'll discuss your future here later. For now, you're done for the day. Go home. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of humiliation and regret. Then, without a word, he untied his apron and walked out of the Sterling room, the heavy door swinging shut behind him. The silence lingered for a moment longer before Elijah approached his mother's table. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his stern demeanor softening. Are you okay, Mom? He asked quietly. Mrs. Ellington smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. I'm fine, son. You handled that well. Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. I should have stepped in sooner. No, she replied gently. You let him reveal his character. Sometimes, that's more powerful than confronting someone right away. The restaurant returned to its usual hum, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Patrons who had witnessed the scene now looked at Mrs. Ellington with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. Elijah returned to his table, though the lingering anger in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. Meanwhile, Dana ensured Mrs. Ellington's meal was served promptly, personally presenting each dish with an apology so heartfelt it felt as though she were trying to undo the actions of the entire evening. At a nearby table, a young couple whispered to each other. I can't believe he treated her like that, the woman said, shaking her head. It makes you think about how often this happens. And no one says anything. Her partner nodded thoughtfully. It's not just about what you see. It's about what you're willing to stand up against when it happens. Elijah overheard their conversation as he passed by. Their words stayed with him. He thought about how many times people like Ethan had gotten away with mistreatment simply because no one had been watching or cared enough to intervene. When Elijah sat beside his mother again, she reached across the table and took his hand. You've built something beautiful here, Elijah, she said softly. But remember, a place like this isn't just about food or ambience. It's about how people feel when they walk through those doors. I know, Mom, Elijah replied, his voice tinged with regret. I let you down tonight. She shook her head. No, you didn't. You gave everyone here a chance to see the truth. And you handled it with integrity. That's what matters. Around them, the staff seemed more attentive, the service more thoughtful. It wasn't just about avoiding another incident. It was about the unspoken lesson Elijah's actions had taught them. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Ellington finished her meal, she glanced around the room. Her gaze settled on Dana, who offered her a small, apologetic smile. There was no bitterness in Mrs. Ellington's expression, only quiet satisfaction that the moment had left an impression. For Elijah, the lesson wasn't just for Ethan or the staff, it was a reminder for himself, too. Leadership wasn't just about managing operations. It was about upholding the values that made the Sterling Room a place worth visiting. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Ellington prepared to leave. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped into the crisp night air. For a moment, they stood there together, the warm glow of the restaurant's windows illuminating their faces. "You did good, son," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that softened the tension of the night. Elijah smiled faintly. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a hand on his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's the real change." He nodded, watching as she made her way to the car waiting by the curb. Before getting in, she turned back and gave him one last smile. Inside, Dana gathered the staff for a brief meeting. Her tone was serious yet constructive. "What happened tonight is a wake-up call," she said. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the culture we're creating here. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. No exceptions." The staff nodded, their expression solemn. Ethan's absence was a reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professionalism. As Elijah returned to the dining room, he took in the quiet hum of the restaurant, the weight of the evening settling on him. The events of the night had reaffirmed his commitment to making the Sterling Room more than just a restaurant. It had to be a place where dignity and kindness were served alongside the finest meals. For the guests who had witnessed it all, the night would linger in their minds. They had come for fine dining, but they left with a story about respect, about standing up, and about the quiet strength of those who refused to let injustice define them.